All right, so this week's lovely reading is chapter on real property law. And there's a surprising amount of real property law lawyers and paralegals in town. But when you think about the cost of home ownership in this town and just how expensive it is to live here in general, with rent and all of that, it makes sense that there would be a lot of litigation about the cost of homes, whether or not somebody owes rent, whether they can abate rent, that sort of thing. So it's not always the type of law that students consider when they're thinking about going into law, but there are a lot of jobs in it typically. All right, I'll let you read your goals and objectives on your own. And I do want you to know the difference between real and personal property. Real property is anything that's attached to land, and permanently attached. Personal property is something that can be moved, even though you couldn't necessarily move it by yourself. If we had the mythological most strong man in the world, Hercules, he could move it, then it's personal property. So a recreational vehicle would be personal property under that category. Okay. There are very different rules regarding real property versus personal property, so it's very important to know the difference between the two. Taxes is one way they're treated differently. And we mentioned, there's a lot of law in this area, and here's some great websites for landlords and tenants. Okay. So I've also given you a nice table on the differences between real and personal property, and this is something I usually like to test on. Okay, so real estate agents are similar to lawyers in that they help someone else and they act on behalf of another person called the principal. All right, multiple listing service. Most homes are pretty much on the multiple listing service, and this will give a lot of information about the property. And there's a lot more disclosure in real property about faults in the property than there is with personal property, which is more like caveat emptor, which is Latin for let the buyer beware. So, things that will be listed in the multiple listing property, and I gave an example of a $2,650,000 property. I thought, hey, if we're gonna dream, let's dream big, huh? Nice home, very pretty, very Spanish style looking, very spread out. It'll give the price. It'll talk about what type of property. Is it commercial? Is it residential? Is it for one family, for more than one family? It'll talk about where it is located. It'll go into further detail in the multiple listing. It will talk about all the attributes. It won't so much give like the bad stuff in the multiple listing. Those disclosures come when you start looking at the property. Things like whether or not the house is allegedly haunted might have to be disclosed even. Things like whether or not there was ever a murder on the property or somebody died on the property can all be things that might have to be disclosed. All right, so this one's just going on and on about what a gorgeous property it is. It's got a private gated entrance, ooh la la, jacuzzi, kids playroom, granite countertops, wine cellar, etc. So it'll give you a lot of detail, but it won't really have the negatives of the property in the multiple listing service listing. So real estate contracts, they're usually going to be contingent. Most people, especially in San Diego, cannot afford to buy a house for cash. And if they already have a house, they would need to sell their house in order to get a new home. So real estate contracts can have contingencies, meaning the buyer of a new property might have that buying of that new property contingent upon selling their old property. Very few people can actually afford to come in all cash, kind of like you see on TV, especially when the median home price is anywhere from $400,000 to $450,000, depending on the market. So it might also be contingent upon financing, but most people in San Diego typically try to get their financing in place, their loan, and know how much money they have to spend before going home shopping. Things are also contingent upon the inspection. So for things like termite damage, other types of damages like plumbing, you don't agree to buy a house no matter what typically, unless you have like a quitclaim deed when you buy the house as is. All right. Once the offer is accepted, and we talked about contracts earlier in the semester, once the offer is accepted, it's a binding contract. So there actually can be damages paid if the deal falls through, depending. And I've had a few lawsuits where people got upset, usually like homes in La Jolla, where the offer was accepted and then they didn't close. So big lawsuits about that. All right, mortgage. When somebody gets a mortgage, the home is basically the collateral on that loan, and so if somebody doesn't pay their mortgage, the bank can go ahead and take that home back. And then they usually do a foreclosure and sell it as is. And if the owner of that home who was kicked out, if they don't get all the money back that was due on the loan, that person can still owe money. So kind of harsh. All right. Foreclosure is for real property typically. And I've given you an example of foreclosure, and I suggest just kind of slowly reading that one. All right, mortgages are typically for 15 or 30 years. If you were paying attention to the recession, typically, if you can, you want to try to get a fixed rate mortgage, one that's not variable and goes up or down. However, I know, and a lot of people know that that's not always possible. But here's an idea of house payments, how much it would cost for a 30-year mortgage. So if somebody bought a condo for $300,000, they're looking at payments over every month for over 30 years of anywhere from like $1,400 to almost $2,000. So oftentimes the mortgage payment is very similar to a rental payment. It's coming up with that down payment that's so hard for most of us to do. All right, so fee simple absolute is how, if you ever get to buy a property, you want to try to buy it. And we want to tell our clients that as well, because it gives us the most rights with our property. So we can sell it, we can leave it to our heirs, we can rent it, all sorts of things. Now, sometimes people can have the right to use a property during their lifetime, and that's known as a life estate, and then it would go back to the real owner after you die. All right, tenancy by the entirety. Typically in California, husbands and wives, they owe the entire property with a right of survivorship, meaning that if one of them dies, well, I take that back actually. So tenancy by the entirety is a little bit different than joint tenancy. Okay, in California, typically most husbands and wives do get their property with right of survivorship, meaning that if one of the spouses dies, it automatically goes to the other one. Sorry, I was a little bit confusing on that. Okay, let's move on to tenancy in common. Read that one on your own. They're a little bit confusing, so slow down, read them, read your book on it. There's slight differences. I typically don't test on tenancy in common because it's a little bit confusing, but just something to consider if you're thinking about going into real property law. All right, most lovely homeowners do get what's known as a title search to make sure that they own everything in that property and there's not like somebody encroaching, there's not an easement, that sort of thing. Okay, so in real property, almost everything has to be in writing, and it makes sense when you're talking about such, expensive deals. All right, the general warranty deed is much better than a quitclaim deed. It comes with all of these lovely covenants. Okay, so that's much better than a quitclaim deed, which you get nothing, no guarantees whatsoever. You're taking the property as is. If there's a problem, you're out of luck. All right, the closing you can read on your own. Taxes. So property taxes are one of the most expensive types of taxes that most people have if they own a home. Very expensive, and it's very interesting where that money goes towards. This is for all of San Diego County, and including Chula Vista. 43.2% of property taxes go to schools. Now, the next biggest one is county. And then we've got city fees, redevelopment, and it's just intriguing because it goes all the way down to 0.7 for the library. All right, make sure as usual you concentrate on your review questions so that you can be studying and preparing for your final examination.